hear about Lord Krishna. So I just chose one verse from Vṛtrāsura's prayers. We will read that and then we will discuss two aspects. Aham Hare Tava Pada Ekamula Aham Hare Tava Pada Ekamula
Asankasaha Vitasmi Bhuyaha Manaha Smarita Pasupatehe Gunan Te Vinita Karma Karotu Ayaha Vinitava Karma Karotu Ayaha Aham Hare Tava Padekamulam Asanudaso Bhavitasmi Bhuyaha Manasmaritasu Pate Gunamste Prinitava Karma Karotu Kayaha Aham Hare Tava Padekamulam Asanudaso Bhavitasmi Bhuyaha Manasmaritasu Pate Gunamste लाइव इसमें दिखा नहीं रहा है, स्ट्रीम में कर दिया, स्ट्रीम में स्टार्ट हो गया। अभी यूट्यूब में गया, यूट्यूब में लाइव कहाँ पे आता है? Aham Hare Tava Padekamulam Asanudaso Bhavitasmi Bhuyaha Manasmaritasu Pate Gunamste Prinitava Karma Karotu Kayaha Aham Hare Tava Padekamulam Asanudaso Bhavitasmi Bhuyaha Manasmaritasu Pate Gunamste Prinitava Karma Karotu Kayaha Aham Hare Tava Padekamulam Asanudaso Bhavitasmi Bhuyaha Manasmaritasu Pate Gunamste Prinitava Karma Karotu Kayaha Aham Hare Tava Padekamulam Asanudaso Bhavitasmi Bhuyaha Manasmaritasu Pate Gunamste Prinitava Karma Karotu Kayaha Online Hare Tava Padekamulam
दासानुदासो भवितास्मि भूयः
दासानुदासो भवितास्मि भूयः
अस्मरेतासु पतिर्गुणांस्ते
स्मरेतासु पतिर्गुणांस्ते
गृहीतवाक्कर्म करोतु कायः
गृहीतवा कर्म करोतु कायः। देवी प्रभु I Hare, O my Lord, Tava, of your Lordship, Ada Ekamula, whose only shelter is the lotus feet, Dasa Anudasaha, the servant of your servant, Vṛtrāsura, shall I become, Bhuyaha, again, Manaha, my mind, Smareta, may remember, Asupatehe, of the Lord of my life, Gunan, the attributes, Te, of your lordships, Pranita, may chant, Vak, my words, Karma, activities of service to you, Karotu, may perform, Ayaha, my body. Translation worked by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Jai Srila Prabhupada. Translation. O my Lord, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, will I again be able to be a servant of your eternal servants who find shelter only at your lotus feet? O Lord of my life, may I again become their servant so that my mind may always think of your transcendental attributes, my words always glorify those attributes, and my body always engage in the loving service of your Lordship. Translation with repetition. O my Lord, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, will I again be able to be a servant of your eternal servants who find shelter only at your lotus feet. O Lord of my life, may I again become their servant so that my mind may always think of your transcendental attributes. My words always glorify those attributes. And my body always engage in the loving service of your Lordship.
Jai Shri Prabhupada.
This verse gives the sum and substance of devotional life. One must become a servant of the servant of the servant of the Lord. Dasa. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu advised, and he also showed by his own example, that a living entity should always desire to be a servant of the servant of the servant of Krishna, the maintainer of the gopis. Gopi Bhartu Padakamayor Dasa. This means that one must accept a spiritual master who comes in a disciplic succession and is a servant of the Lord. Under this direction, one must then engage one's three properties, namely his body, mind, and words. The body should be engaged in physical activity under the order of the master. The mind should think of Krishna incessantly, and one's words should be engaged in preaching the glories of the Lord. If one is thus engaged in the loving service of the Lord, one's life is successful. Thus, Transcendental Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada. Om Ajnana-timirandasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Peshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare.
What is the internet issue?
Hare Krishna. So this is a prayer which is offered by Vṛtrāsura, and this I felt is a very nice prayer which is very much applicable for all of us to meditate upon, especially as we're coming closer to celebrate Janmashtami. All of us want to serve the Lord, please the Lord, and get the mercy of the Lord. And as we were seeing during today's morning yesterday's discussion, as how understanding the Lord, Janma Karma Samedevya, Evam Yogeti Tattvataha. So to understand in Tattvataha, in truth, the birth and the activities of the Lord enables one to be liberated and go back to the spiritual world. So as the practitioners, as devotees, we are all endeavoring to make an attempt that we actually understand and realize the Supreme Lord. As Prabhupada says, to the extent that one can. Not everyone can understand the Lord completely, but to the extent as it is described by the Acharyas, as it is when the Lord reveals Himself. So in this process, everyone is endeavoring to attain this perfection and go back to home, back to Godhead. But as we see, sometimes it is not so simple as it appears. Then one may wonder, what are the reasons? The process of devotional service, the process of hearing is very clear, at least the process as described by the Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas as presented by Srila Prabhupada, the process seems to be very, very clear. There is no ambiguity, like in some cases there are different spiritual organizations which may create different ambiguities about you can do this also, you can do that also, or you can do whatever you like also. But unlike those processes, the Bhakti Yoga process as recommended by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as recommended by Lord Krishna himself in Bhagavad Gita, and as elaborated by the Acharyas, it seems to be very, very definitive. It seems to be very exact, precise. But then what is that is preventing one from actually developing those qualities, as we were looking yesterday, the word meaning of Shraddha, that one who is anxious to hear the pastimes and the glories of the Lord, one who is anxious to hear. Where does this anxiety come from? Or where does this anxiety does not come from? Why does not it come from? Why it does not come to us sometimes? So one may wonder that the process is clear, but the progression in the process seems to be slower than one can have maybe. So what is the reason? So I thought, as we are all preparing our consciousness to understand Krishna, receive mercy from Krishna, this verse seemed, for some reasons, I just came across this verse, and then I thought we'll discuss a few things about this. So this is a beautiful verse where Vṛtrāsura is saying,
So he's saying, O my Lord, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, Hare, O my Lord. So he's saying, will I again be able to be a servant of your eternal servants who find shelter only at your lotus feet? So here Vṛtrāsura is talking about a certain kind of servants of the Lord. Who are those servants? Those servants, they have a very specific quality. Their quality is Pada Eka Mula. These devotees, these servants of the Lord, they have only one thing, that is, their shelter is the lotus feet of the Lord. So actually, if one wants to really make progress, if one wants to really please Lord, one wants to really serve the Lord, then one must actually find a servant who is Pada Eka Mula, whose only shelter is the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord. And then what to do when we find a devotee whose shelter is only the lotus feet of the Lord? So here Vṛtrāsura is saying that, will I again be able to be a servant of your eternal servants who find shelter only at your lotus feet? So when one wants to approach the Lord, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has very specifically described by his own behavior and in his own teachings as how one should approach the Lord, or how one can actually become a devotee of the Lord. And that is also being described here by Vṛtrāsura, that one can not actually become a devotee of the Lord just like that, just by approaching the Lord directly. This is not the process. If we really want to become devotees of the Lord, the process is one has to first find a servant of the Lord whose only shelter is the lotus feet of the Lord. And then one must become a servant of that pure servant of the Lord. In fact, as we see later on in the purport, one should not only become the servant of that pure servant of the Lord, but one must become a servant of the servant of the servant of the servant of the pure servant of the Lord. And it is by that process that one can actually please the Lord the most. And that is a secret. This, although looks very simple, it is missed out, because the idea of being a servant of the servant, as we all know that the constitutional position of a living entity as described by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is Krishna Nitya Das. One is to be an eternal servant of the Lord. But because we are bewildered by the material energy, the idea of being a servant vanquishes very easily. So unless the idea of servant is not fixed, where is the question of service? We all want to do devotional service. We all want to develop a ruchi for Krishna Katha. As we are seeing, what is the panacea, what is the medicine for the cure, for the conditioned living entity? Nivritta tarshar upagiyamanat, bhavashadat shotra manobhiramat. So for people who are already liberated, just like as we see in the compositions of the Goswamis, they are already liberated, and therefore when they think of the name of the Lord, they say, can I have millions of ears and millions of tongues? And when they think of the Lord's pastimes, they are filled with ecstasy. But for those who are in this material world filled with material desires and still not liberated, this acts as a medicine. But as we know, despite this being a medicine, we do not want to take the medicine. Now, why is that is happening? Why is that, although it is so nice, what is that is preventing us from getting there? So one aspect is that the ability of the devotee must develop this attitude of being a servant of the servant. So when this attitude of being a servant of the servant comes into the individual, then the progression of actually doing some meaningful service begins. Until then, because the idea of servant is not very fixed in us, the idea of master creeps in along with the service. So whenever there is a service which is given, the idea of servant is not very fixed. The idea of master creeps into it. So when the idea of master creeps into it, it no more becomes a service, it becomes personal enjoyment. So it is this factor which makes our so-called service not really a service. And therefore, we do not see the fruit of the devotional service. Although devotional service is meant to bring all auspiciousness, it is meant to bring all bliss, all happiness, remove all distress. It is the only one thing which can conquer the Lord. In spite of all these wonderful qualities of devotional service, because of this wrong attitude that one carries while rendering devotional service, one does not develop the taste. So the one important attitude is to learn to become a servant of the servant. And that is very important. And why is that important? And then Vṛtrāsura is saying, may I become their servant, may I again become their servant, so that my mind may always think of your transcendental attributes. So Vṛtrāsura is saying that only if I become the servant of that pure servant, or if I become the servant of the servant of the servant of a pure devotee or the Supreme Lord, then so that my mind may always think of your transcendental attributes. So in order to think of the wonderful transcendental attributes of the Lord is very difficult, unless it is not obtained by the mercy of the pure devotee of the Lord. It is not possible for one to conceive the transcendental attributes of the Lord. Our mind, as we were even the last class yesterday evening, there was a question about the logical mind. Yes, the mind which is perceiving this phenomenal world, of this experience of this material world, for it to conceive anything beyond it is very, very difficult. And that the projection of this world is so much ingrained into us that for us to think anything beyond this becomes very, very difficult. So for us, therefore, to comprehend anything beyond this perception that we have got is almost impossible, unless one does not become a servant of the pure devotee of the Lord. Only then, by their mercy, and the mercy of Guru and Krishna, that one can actually conceive, understand, get a sense of the wonderful transcendental attributes of the Lord. And when one mind is able to conceive the transcendental attributes, think of the transcendental attributes of the Lord, then Vṛtrāsura is saying, my words always glorify those attributes. So as soon as one is able to relish, appreciate these beautiful transcendental qualities, then naturally one will not be able to stop from speaking those wonderful attributes. As we were seeing this example of gulab jamun coming again and again, just like there is a theoretical understanding of gulab jamun and there is a factual experience of gulab jamun. But once there is a factual experience of gulab jamun, and if that gulab jamun is very nice, and we immediately say, oh, you must have this gulab jamun made by so and so devotee, it is so nice, all of you must come and taste this. So as soon as our mind is starting to think of the transcendental attributes, our words also start to talk about those attributes of the Lord. So when my mind, my words, and then Vṛtrāsura is saying, not only engaging my mind and the words, and my body always engage in the loving service of your Lordship. So as we know, we have all got, like today there was a question on in how many divisions the material nature expands, the 3 modes of material nature, and it says 16, and then Prabhu was explaining the 5 senses and 5 knowledge senses and 5 working senses. So this body which is made up of these senses also need to be engaged in the loving service of the Lord. So unless we are not developing the attitude of being a servant of the servant, the body does not want to engage in the loving service of the Lord. It is interested in one's own service. or it's interested in some other service. So Vṛtrāsura is asking a question here: will I be able to be a servant of your eternal servants? Or so only by that the rest of the things can happen. So Prabhupada in the purport very nicely is stating the first line. This verse gives the sum and substance of devotional life. So this is quite a big statement. Sum and substance of devotional life. So what is the sum and substance of devotional life? That one must first become a servant of the servant of the servant of the Lord. So this is the very fundamental principle. Unless we do not develop this attitude, unless we do not learn how to become a servant of the servant of the servant of the Lord, we cannot please, we cannot render service. Service, in order to do service, we need to become this. Bhavitasmi, when shall I become? So that should be our goal. Our first goal is that, am I becoming a good servant of the servant of the servant of the Lord? The moment Prabhupada says that one is actually glorified, the more 100 times one is servant of the servant of the servant of the servant, that many times higher one is glorified. Usually in the material world, moment one is considered lower in designation, one is considered not of significance, not worthy of to be glorified. But on the other hand, in the spiritual world, in the spiritual realm, the more one develops the attitude of being a servant of the servant of the servant, the more one is glorified. And Prabhupada is quoting here, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu advised, and he also showed by his own example, that a living entity should always desire to be a servant of the servant of the servant of Krishna, the maintainer of the gopis. Gopi bhartu padakamalayur dasa dasa anudasa. So Prabhupada is quoting here a verse from Chaitanya Charitamrita, where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, I am not this, I am not this. So he's saying, I am not any one of from the 4 varnas and 4 ashramas. So he's saying, Naham vipro nacha narapatir, napi vaishyo na shudro, naham varni na cha grihapatir, no manasto yatirva, kintu prodyan nikhila, paramananda purnamrutabdhir, gopi bhartu padakamalyor dasa dasa anudasa. So in this verse, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is saying, I am not a Brahmana, I am not a Kshatriya, I am not a Vaishya or a Shudra, nor am I a brahmachari, a householder, a vanaprastha or a sannyasi. I identify myself only as the servant of the servant of the servant of the lotus feet of Lord Krishna, the maintainer of the gopis. He is like an ocean of nectar and is the cause of universal transcendental bliss, is always existing with brilliance. So the identification, the identity, although in one place we say that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said that I am the eternal servant of the Lord Krishna, that is the constitutional position, but here Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is identifying himself as the servant of the servant of the servant of the lotus feet of Lord Krishna. So you can see this is even more finer understanding of what is the understanding of the servant of the Lord mean. Krishna Nitya Das. So it is not one can actually claim oneself to be a direct servant of the Lord. This is a very important principle, and that is also Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself is stating that. This means that one must accept a spiritual master who comes in the disciplic succession and is a servant of the servant of the Lord. So when we are talking of the servant of the servant of the servant of the Lord, so first we need to identify who is the pure servant of the Lord. And then one must accept to render service to that pure servant of the Lord. And without understanding, without coming in touch with the pure servant of the Lord, it is not possible to actually render service to the Lord. Because it is through the spiritual master, the pure devotee of the Lord, one accepts the service and offers it to the Supreme Lord. So therefore, rendering service to the spiritual master is very important. And as we see in Srimad Bhagavatam, this verse says, Shushusho Shraddhadanasya Vasudeva Katharuchi Shyan Mahat Sevya Vipra Punya Tirtha Niveshanat. So Shushrusho Shraddhadanasya. Again the word Shraddha is coming. And here Prabhupada is translating with care and attention. So here is saying, by serving those devotees who are completely freed from all vice, great service is done. So here again that Mahat Sevaya, Mahat Sevaya, by service rendered to pure devotees. So this is a very important principle, that one must actually come in contact with the pure devotee of the Lord. And one must render service to a pure devotee of the Lord. By such service, one gets affinity for hearing the message of Vasudeva. So unless one does not render service to a pure devotee of the Lord, the taste Vasudeva Katha Ruchi. So as we are discussing, we need to develop the taste, we need to become anxious to hear about the Supreme Lord. But that anxiety is not coming. Why is it not coming? Because to gain that affinity for hearing, we need to render service. And therefore, when an opportunity of service comes, we must be very eager to render that service, so that by rendering that service, we may develop the taste to hear about the Lord. So unless we do not render service, the three modes of material nature which are acting upon us, they carry us in another direction. Therefore, so in the right attitude of being the servant of the servant of the servant, and rendering service, service means to please, to act according to instructions, according to desires, according to rules and regulations given by the spiritual master. So when one is able to do that, then one is being gradually freed from abhadra, the inauspicious things in the heart. As long as our heart is absorbed with inauspicious things, with mundane things, our attention and absorption on the Lord does not come. But in order to overcome, we must begin Ado Shraddha, Tatha Sadhu Sangha, Bhajana Kriya. So Bhajana Kriya, so we must come in the association of devotees, and Bhajana Kriya, so we need to render the bhajana, or doing hearing in the association of devotees, doing kirtan, and rendering service. So when we do this in the association of devotee, then gradually our affinity. So Prabhupada says, this ruchi to come, one has to overcome the stage of anartha nivritti. So without overcoming the stage of anartha nivritti, the idea of ruchi does not come. So that idea, that anartha nivritti stage, if one has to overcome, that one can overcome only in the association of devotees. It is when one is rendering devotional service in the association of devotees, that's where the false ego comes. How does one handle one's false ego? Because the false ego is taking one away from the servant of the servant. It is creating another identity of something else, of being a master of certain kind. So immediately when there are two masters, there is a conflict. And that's why we see there is so much conflicts when services happen. Because everyone is trying to be a master. If there is only one master, then there is no problem. Just like we saw even earlier when there were some meetings, Prabhu was explaining about the concentric circles. In the concentric circles, there is no conflict. But as soon as there are non-concentric circles, that each one has one's own different center, then there is immediately a conflict. So anyways, so the point here is that in the association of devotees, when one is rendering service to pure devotees, like the ISKCON is an institution, where IHF Boston is an institution, where one can come together in the association of devotees, render service, Mahat Sevaya, to a pure devotee, Srila Prabhupada. It is in this association, when one is rendering service to the pure devotee of the Lord, then gradually that affinity to hear the message of the Vasudeva will come. So therefore, identifying a pure devotee, and in the association of devotees, when we render service, that anartha nivritti syat. So that anartha nivritti takes place, and then gradually this taste of ruchi comes. So one must be willing to go through this process. It is not an immediate step that immediately, as we saw, that there are 9 cantos before one actually reaches to hear about the glories of Lord Krishna in 10th canto. Because there is a process, there is a preparation that is required for one's consciousness to actually welcome the Lord, to actually develop the taste for hearing the Lord. So that is also similarly, it is also in the practical process, we need to undergo that service in the association of devotee to overcome the stage of anartha nivritti. Then the taste for hearing will come. And then here it is said, then under his direction, that is spiritual master's direction, one must then engage one's 3 properties, namely his body, mind and words. This is a very nice practical instruction that we need to engage all the 3, the body, mind and the words. So body, when we are using, we may be using for different reasons. Just like when we are eating, eating can be a service to keep our body healthy so that we can do better service. We can walk, we can use our hands, various things we can use in the service of the Lord. And how do we understand how to use our body, mind and words? From hearing the instructions of the pure devotee. So pure devotee has given us instructions. Srila Prabhupada has given us instructions as how do we use our body, mind and words. And the institution helps us to create different opportunities to engage all these 3 things in the service of the Lord. The body should be engaged in physical activity under the orders of the master. So this is a very important principle, that the body should be engaged in physical activity under the order of the master. As I mentioned elsewhere earlier, that these 2 principles of service is, one is that when there is an instruction, there should be a sincerity in executing that instruction, and 2, it must be always under the order of the master. And here it is being said the body should be engaged in physical activity under the order of the master. So this is another very important principle to keep in mind, under the order of the spiritual master. And I thought I'll just take one pastime from Krishna book to illustrate this. Yes. So in the chapter of meeting of Lord Krishna with Sudama Brahmana, there is this wonderful narration, this wonderful description where Lord Krishna speaks to Sudama, and here he says, my dear Brahmana friend, my dear friend, I think you remember our activities during the days when we were living as students. You may remember that once we went to collect fuel from the forest on the order of Guru's wife. While we were collecting the dried wood, we by chance entered the dense forest and became lost. There was an unexpected dust storm, and then clouds and lightning in the sky and the explosive sound of thunder. Then sunset came, and we were lost in the dark jungle. After this, there was severe rainfall. The whole ground was overflooded with water, and we could not trace out the way to return to our Guru's ashrama. You may remember that the heavy rainfall, it was not actually rainfall, but a sort of devastation. On account of the dust storm and the heavy rain, we began to feel greatly pained, and in whichever direction we turned, we were bewildered. In that distressed condition, we took each other's hand and tried to find our way out. We passed the whole night in that way, and early in the morning, when our absence became known to our Gurudeva, he sent other disciples to search us out. He also came with them, and when they reached us in the jungle, they found us to be very distressed. With great compassion, our Gurudeva said, so this is the on the order of Gurudeva's wife, the Guru's wife, the Lord Krishna and Sudama, they went to nearby forest to collect some fuel. And as they were collecting some dried wood, they saw that they entered into a dense forest, and it was all raining, there was dense clouds, and there was lightning, and they could not find their way out. And the next day, when the other disciples of the Guru finds them, then eventually they come back, and then the spiritual master, the Gurudev, says, with great compassion, our Gurudev said, "My dear boys, it is very wonderful that you have suffered so much trouble for me. Everyone likes to take care of his body as the first consideration, but you are so good and faithful to your Guru that without caring for bodily comforts, you have taken so much trouble for me. I'm also glad to see that bona fide students like you will undergo any kind of trouble for the satisfaction of the spiritual master." So here is a wonderful instruction that the spiritual master is so pleased that the disciples have taken so much difficulty that without taking into consideration any of their difficulties, without caring for their bodily comforts, they have taken difficulty so as to please the spiritual master. And so this principle, that when the students are willing to undergo any kind of trouble for the satisfaction of the spiritual master, that is the way for a bona fide disciple to become free from his debt to the spiritual master. It is the duty of the disciple to dedicate his life to the service of the spiritual master. My dear best of the twice born, I am greatly pleased by your action, and I bless you. May all your desires and ambitions be fulfilled. May the understanding of the Vedas, which you have learned from me, always continue to remain within your memory, so that at every moment you can remember the teachings of the Vedas and quote their instructions without difficulty. Thus, you will never be disappointed in this life or in the next. So, this is a beautiful instruction. The Supreme Lord Himself is narrating this event which happened before to Sudama, and the Lord Himself is setting an example of how important it is to satisfy one's spiritual master, to dedicate one's life to the service of the spiritual master. One may be in different ashrama, one may be in different conditions of life. Those are all secondary according to Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. If one is able to serve and please and satisfy the spiritual master, then one is a bona fide disciple. One has perfected his spiritual life, because the key is in pleasing, satisfying the spiritual master. As the other day we were also saying how Jayananda Prabhu was a wonderful example, how he always served Srila Prabhupada, how he always tried to please Prabhupada in different ways. And similarly, if our desire is to satisfy and please the spiritual master, then we can see how one can receive the blessings of the spiritual master. And here you can see the blessings of the spiritual master. May all your desires and ambitions be fulfilled. May the understanding of the Vedas which you have learned from me always continue to remain within your memory. So we can see that the blessings of the spiritual master is the key. The blessings of the Vaishnavas are the key ingredients for one's devotional progress. If one is not careful to while rendering devotional service, if one is not very careful to see whether it is satisfying the spiritual master, whether it is pleasing Vaishnavas, so simply by doing devotional service in the right attitude, in the right way, the blessings one receives from the Vaishnavas and the spiritual master can make one's life perfect. And it is by that one can also understand the higher transcendental attributes of the Lord. Because without the mercy of the Vaishnavas, without the mercy of the pure devotee, it is not possible for us to actually factually experience and understand the intricacies of the scriptures or the devotional life. And it is also said in Chaitanya Charitamrita elsewhere that not have that verse with me right now. Okay. So it says, Krishna Bhakti Janma Moola Haya Sadhu Sangha. Krishna Prema Janme Tenho Puna Mukhya Anga. The root cause of devotional service to Lord Krishna is association with advanced devotees. Even when one's dormant love for Krishna awakens, association with devotees is still most essential. So this is instruction to Sanatana Goswami. Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is saying that in order to the root cause of devotional service to Lord Krishna is association with advanced devotees. So this association of devotees. So unless we do not learn how to associate with devotees who are around us, how do we expect that we learn how to associate with pure devotees of the Lord? How do we expect that we can please them? So the importance of association of devotees is very much emphasized throughout Chaitanya Charitamrita. That without the association of devotees, without the association with advanced devotees, there is no question of devotional life. So we may sometimes think that we can directly approach the spiritual master, we can directly approach the Supreme Lord, but actually that is not the process. The process is to become servant of the servant. And it is in this process that, as Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, Trinadapi suni chena tarorapi sahishnuna amanina manadena kirtaniya sadahari. So this simple principle, actually Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has simplified the entire philosophy. And he has given in a very simple practical way how actually we can understand Krishna, how we can actually render devotional service. So this attitude that we need to develop in the association of devotees is Trinadapi sunechena tarorapi sahishnuna amanina manadena. To constantly endeavor not to expect respect while giving respect to everyone. So it's a wonderful opportunity for all of us when we are in the association of devotees. There will be different circumstances. Sometimes there will be respect, sometimes there may not be respect. But still, am I willing to give respect to everyone? Am I still humble and tolerant despite of the circumstantial gain and loss, fame, infamy? So when one is able to practice this in the association of devotees and get the blessings of the devotees, in the process one also receives the blessings of the spiritual master, because when he sees, oh, he is acting so well as such a nice servant of my servant, I am very pleased. And similarly, Lord is very much pleased when he sees, oh, he is a servant of the servant of the servant. He is rendering his devotional service so well. Sometimes we get lost in so many external attributes of this world and existence that we forget the key to all this is my consciousness and my activity that I am rendering right now to please the Vaishnavas, Srila Prabhupada and the Lord. So when we are in the right consciousness, as we see in the case of Prahlad Maharaj, because he was a devotee of the Lord, constantly engaged in devotional service, circumstantially there may be so many problems, so many troubles, but he could all overcome by the mercy of the Lord. So similarly, here we can see this beautiful prayer of Vṛtrāsura that in which Prabhupada is saying in the last line, if one is thus engaged in the loving service of the Lord, one's life is successful. So if we engage our physical abilities of this body under the order of the spiritual master, mind thinking of Krishna, just like we had a wonderful quiz today, which was engaging our mind to read, to understand, to think about Krishna. And similarly, one's words should be used engaged in preaching the glories of the Lord. So we have wonderful service opportunities for to engaging all of these three, body, mind and words, in the service of the Lord, which is nicely arranged in an institution like this. And we have the association of devotees, we have the pure devotee, Srila Prabhupada, and if we just simply all of us come together and engage nicely in the service of the Lord, Prabhupada says one's life is successful. And we all need to develop this. Prabhupada is using a very special word here, loving service of the Lord. priti purvakam, in a devotional way, in a loving way. Even if we do little service to the Lord, one's life is successful. So this is a beautiful prayer, and we can see Lord Krishna himself demonstrating by his own example how he was willing to undergo any sort of difficulty and take any kind of physical activity to please his own spiritual master. So I'll stop here and see if there are any questions or comments. If there are no questions or comments, we'll stop here. Granth Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki, Jai Gaur Premanande. Thank you for joining. Hare Krishna.